page 40. The Art and Science of Low Carbohydrate Living, an expert guide to making the life-saving benefits of carbohydrate restriction sustainable and enjoyable. By Jeff S. Volek, Ph.D., Rhode and Stephen D. Phinney, M.D., Ph.D. Section 2. Perspective. Chapter 2. Low Carbohydrate Lessons from Aboriginal Cultures. 2.1. Introduction and Caveat. Human experience with low-carbohydrate diets began when this planet's first primates chased down and killed some unfortunate but succulent animal and then could not find any nearby wild tubers to serve with the meat. Rather than starve, they probably decided with some reluctance to accept the indignity of a meal consisting of just meat and fat. That event likely occurred well over 2 million years ago, after which our ancestors stumbled about in the dietary darkness until the development of modern agriculture brought us a dependable supply of carbohydrates starting maybe 8,000 years ago. And in some remote corners of the earth, the arrival of agricultural carbohydrate has only occurred within the last century. But for almost all of our ancestors, in the intervening 2 million years, humans had to figure out how to make do with just meat and fat as their primary sources of dietary energy. Getting a low-carbohydrate diet right is not as simple as just avoiding sugars and starches. One has to decide how much and what sources of protein and fats to seek out. Then comes developing methods to prepare them and maybe even to store them. Along with enough energy and protein, our intrepid ancestors also had to figure out how to get their minimum requirement for minerals and vitamins to reach adulthood and reproduce. Given the obvious fact that at least some of them survived this gauntlet, there had to have been pockets of people who figured it all out. But maybe it's not all that much of a surprise. After all, they had around 2 million years of trial and error to do so. Practically speaking, what this means is that most of the important principles of carbohydrate-restricted diets were discovered eons ago. Unfortunately, those people holding this information were usually not literate, so this dietary information was never carved in stone and thus tended to die with them, and with their cultures. Equally unfortunate, the often literate people whose contact brought agricultural foods to the Earth's last remaining hunting cultures were often less than accurate reporters of the pre-contact cultures they were observing. Thus what we do and know of the dietary practices of aboriginal hunting peoples was seen through the lens of cultural bias. This necessitates an important caveat: beware of ethnocentric interpretation of aboriginal behaviors. It is a normal human tendency to interpret the behavior of others through the lens of our own cultural practices. Nomadic people, for example, are often viewed as unsettled or uncivilized because they do not build and maintain permanent houses or villages. As for dietary practices, people who cannot imagine themselves living without copious dietary carbohydrate, our daily bread, will tend to look for the hidden dietary carbohydrate sources, however improbable, in the diets of hunters. That said, however, it is the hypothesis of this chapter that not all of that is written about the diets of hunters and nomadic shepherds is incorrect, and when assessed against a modern understanding of metabolism, much of the bias and mythology can be peeled away, leaving a sparse but useful truth. The reason we should be motivated to undertake this effort is the inescapable conclusion that the dietary path down which industrialized cultures have wandered this last century is clearly not leading us to health and well-being. And to better understand where we should be going, perhaps it might help to thoughtfully examine where we have been. Seeking credible reporters. It is therefore useful to exercise caution when evaluating reports of observers, even scientifically trained ones, who regard their nomadic objects of study as culturally inferior, or as savages, for that matter. The better observers are those who lived among, ate the food, and traveled with the hunting or herding cultures they were studying. Such individuals included George Catlin among the Plains Indian, 7, John Ray, 9, Frederick Schwatka, 10, and Vilhelmer Stephenson among the Inuit, 8, plus John Knorr and J.L. Gilks among the Maasai, 6. All of these observers comment on the esteem that hunting and herding peoples held for fat. Buffalo hunted in the fall, fattened from a summer of grazing, were used by the Plains Indian to make pemmican, that is, a mixture of dried meat and hot fat that cools to become a stable block when sealed in a rawhide sack. Caribou were similarly hunted in the fall along their migration routes from the tundra back to the forests, when the rapidly dropping temperature allowed the meat and fat to be stored frozen in caches for winter use. Along the Pacific coast, vast quantities of a smelt-like fish, called the oelichin, were harvested, processed, and the egg grease stored in cedar boxes for year-round use and for trade with inland bands. What is generally lacking, however, is accurate quantitative information on the proportions of fat, protein, and carbohydrate eaten by these aboriginal cultures prior to European contact. We do have Orrin Gilk's report, 6, of the daily food intake of a Maasai warrior class male, 1.2 kilograms of meat, 2 liters of milk, and 50 milliliters of blood. But we don't know the fat contents of the meat and milk, which can vary greatly on the cut of the meat, the preparation of the cattle before slaughter, and the amount of cream included in the milk. Finding credible dietary quantitation. Perhaps our best transducer of the pre-contact Inuit diet is Stephenson during his 1 year of closely monitored dietary intake while participating in the Bellevue experiment, see sidebar. With both his reputation and well-being riding on the outcome of this experiment, it is a good assumption that he would have earnestly attempted to reproduce those dietary practices of the Inuit which had previously sustained him for a decade in the Arctic. The published results of this experiment tell us that Stephenson ate 15% of his daily energy as protein, over 80% as fat, and a few percent as carbohydrate, from glycogen naturally found in the meat. 11. Page 47.